All right, welcome back to another week of interpersonal communication. This week we're talking about the dynamics of interpersonal relationships, and we'll be looking at love styles, relational stages, as well as the dark side of relationships. All right, so let's begin by talking about John Lee's colors of love. He said in 1973 that love operates like the color wheel. Right? There are three primary colors in the color wheel: red, blue, and yellow. And he says there are three primary loves in the love wheel. And just like the primary colors combine to form the secondary colors, the colors we know of as green, purple, and orange, the primary styles of love also combine to form secondary styles. All right, so let's look at that color wheel of love. And here we see the three primary types. They're not put on any color for any particular reason, but we've got Eros on yellow, Ludus on red, and Storge on blue. Eros might fit better on red because of what kind of love it's associated with. It is characterized by intense physical and emotional attraction and commitment. This is the Romeo and Juliet love. This is the kind of love that is celebrated in most films and songs that we hear on the radio. It's all about, it's very intense, it's very emotional, it's immediate and powerful. Erotic love also has a very strong sexual component, which also, when you think of Romeo and Juliet, that was a significant component in their relationship. Right? When people think of love, they typically think of erotic love, very intense and very sexual. Secondary primary love style that John Lee proposes is called Ludus. This is a game-playing love, right? That there are a set of rules, and that things should be fun and there should be no commitment, right? The partners do not show any emotional bonding or any intense emotional bonding, but the engagement is typically for pleasure and typically for sexual pleasure. It is, at least in terms of when one is having sex, that's the purpose of it, for pleasure, not for bonding. And the idea is that a ludic lover has multiple partners or multiple lovers at a time, right? Whether there's sexual intimacy or not. Basically, it's the idea that you can date multiple people at a time, and that's okay. Right? So there are people that are ludic lovers and believe that, and there are others who say, no, I'm an erotic lover. Right? We don't really say that, but that's typically how we see it. People tend towards certain types. And the third type of primary love, according to Lee, is Storge, which is characterized by a deep affection, devotion, and commitment. It is based on a solid foundation of trust, respect, and friendship. But unlike Eros or Ludus, it is not very interested in sexual affection. It is more of love is seen more as an extension of friendship, and it's a very important part of life. But it's a love without fever or folly, as Lee says. So more like a platonic love. You might be familiar with that word. All right, so the secondary styles, as I mentioned earlier, are created from combining the two types. And here we have mania, agape, and pragma. Okay. Again, no particular reason they're placed in those places. However, they are based on being a combination of two primary love styles. Okay, so let's first start with pragma, here we have got mania. Mania is an obsessive and intense love. It's a combination of eros, which is very intense, and ludus, which is sort of a game. So here, typically manic lovers lack self-confidence, the self-confidence that eros employs, and the emotional self-control that ludus employs. But they do have, instead, unfortunately, what are self-defeating emotions, a tendency to force affection from the other person, and an inability to believe in or trust in the other person or the affection that other person shows for them. Right? It is an obsessive, intense, game-like love. Right? Game-like being person's always looking for, is the other person following the rules? If they love me, they would do this. Things like that. Manic lovers tend to be less than satisfied. They tend to be unhappy. All right, the second here is pragma, where love is viewed as a practical matter of finding a compatible partner and settling down. It's a combination of Storge and Ludus, and according to John Lee, it's the love that goes shopping for a suitable mate. Here people create a list of desirable qualities and they look for those qualities in a mate. So a lot of people, maybe in our culture, value erotic love, but when it comes down to it, they're very practical. Be practical, and that's pragma, right? Or pragma. And practical love. So marrying somebody that suits you well, that you can have a good family with, that has a job, that's going to be stable, that's going to help take care of you, etc. All right, and thirdly is agape. It is an intense, friendly love. It is often self-sacrificing. It is a combination of eros and storge. So it's an all-giving, selfless love. And in it there's an obligation to love and care for others without any expectation that that love will be returned. It is a truly selfless love. In some cases, the agapic lover will remove themselves from a partnership if they believe that the other person is deserves a better person. Maybe there's somebody else that comes along, but I say, you know what, I'm not good enough for you. You need something else, right? And that could also be a sign of low self-esteem, but I think it can also be a sign of an agapic lover that says, you know, there's something better out there for you, right? Okay, so different love styles. Again, these are not facts, these are just theories, and something I wanted to share with you for this chapter's reading. All right, and here's another graphic that breaks it down pretty simply for you. All right, moving on, let's talk about relationship stages, and this is a pretty important view of how relationships work, what we'll be talking about here. Basically, in general, this is a view of relationships that supposes that each relationship, whether it's friendly or romantic, evolves in stages, right? One of the best known, the one that we'll be discussing here, is Knapp and Evangelisti's Stages of Relational Development model. It was developed prior to 2006, but they've modified it and made some minor changes to help explain it better. Right? All theories basically try to explain the world, and models and theories are basically the same thing. And when faults are identified, the people that created the model come back and fix it. So that's why we see 2006. All right, now, as I said before, these are descriptive models, meaning they describe reality. They're not proscriptive, meaning they don't tell people what to do. Right? So this is how a relationship should work. No, this is according to Knapp and Evangelisti. This is how relationships do work. Right? So you can watch a relationship develop in these stages, or compare your relationships to these stages and see how yours progress, or see where your relationships are, whether they're friendly or romantic. All right, so here's a graphic that shows how the relationship development model works. And you can see the various stages, initiating through terminating, and it's like a staircase, right? The idea here is that you have to go up the staircase in order to come back down, right? And typically, people don't always come all the way back down. Relationships start and stop throughout our lives. Some relationships don't ever stop, though, so it's not important or required that you have to come all the way back down the staircase to terminating. You can hang out and intensifying in the middle of the staircase there, and then go back to intensifying and go back up to integrating. Right? You can maybe never get to bonding, and you can just kind of hang out and stabilizing and integrating for a while. Right? Or you can cross over and walk down the staircase and go from bonding to differentiating to circumscribing, all the way down to terminating. So this is just a three-dimensional way of helping to better understand the model. Now, what's important with this model is that it's not required that individuals go sequentially. Knapp and Evangelisti argue that it is, but it's their model, so they might be more tied to it. Most scholars believe that people can skip stages. They don't necessarily need to go through each one. So that's just, again, this is a model, this is a theory, and people chime in and say how well it describes reality or doesn't. All right, so specifically, they break it down into two parts, and they've added a third. I think that was in 2006, and that's the maintenance part. But the three parts are coming together, relational maintenance, and coming apart. All right, so coming together, the first part is initiating. Here people express basic interest, and that's, you just make it yourself available to that other person, right? You put yourself in a place where you'll be able to meet, you walk up to them, you maintain more than just, you sustain a conversation with them. All right, now the second part is where instead of just casual hello, goodbye, it's you go into more small talk. and this is the experimenting stage where you're seeking common ground. Knapp and Vangelissi have said it's where you're auditioning your friend, right? This person's on a friend audition. So you just talk about little things that you both care about or not and find out if you do have common ground. If you do have common ground, they say the next stage is intensifying. And here's where people start to increase the amount of self-disclosure, right? The breadth being the number of things they talk about, as well as the depth, how deeply they talk about them, right? So do you start talking about all of your hobbies? Do you talk about your high school experiences? Do you talk about your dreams for the future? And how much about those things do you share, right? You might have an experience where you met somebody and you went really deep really quickly. Most of us have, in some time in our life, have an experience with one friend or romantic partner who instantly we felt a connection and we jumped straight to intensifying and told them things about ourselves that we only would share with somebody we were really close to. Typically, that results in a more closer bond, and it's generally reciprocated. If it's not reciprocated, if somebody does not then self-disclose a very deep secret thing to you after you've done that for them, typically that's where things stop and your relationship does not continue to develop any further than that. All right, so once you've increased your level of self-disclosure and you've shared more of yourself, there's some other things that are going on too. There's getting to know each other's partners and each other's friends, family. You might give each other little gifts, do favors for one another. You're definitely going to spend more time together. You might ask one another for support and help in things. And it's in this stage where people are most likely to say, I love you, right? That's kind of interesting. These first two stages, initiating, experimenting, go very fast. And then number 3 goes from, increasing your self-disclosure to saying, I love you, right? So a lot can happen in the intensifying stage. Okay. So number 4, this 4th stage is integrating, right? Here's where we start entering the land of relationship maintenance as well as coming together. Okay, they overlap. There's a great graphic in the textbook about that. All right, so integrating, here's where the two partners begin to take on one identity, right? And again, typically this model works really well for talking about romantic relationships, and that's the kind of verbiage that we use. But it's not just for romantic relationships, right? It's also for friends. Right? So you spend more time together, and you have a sense of becoming sort of one, right? You do more things, you share a certain language maybe, you have certain words for things, and you also start to influence one another's activities and what each other does, right? So instead of going out on the weekend to the beach like you normally would have, this weekend you're going to go camping in the desert because that's what your friend wants to do, or that's what your new boyfriend or girlfriend wants to do. And you say, hey, that sounds cool, I'll do it too. The 5th stage is bonding. And here, people sometimes have a challenge with it, especially today in California, where gay marriage is not legal, right? And that, of course, that's being debated by people still. But here the idea is that there's a public gesture of unity, right? That the two people come together and there's some symbolic public gesture, typically a wedding, okay? Or it can be a signing of a contract together. But what's interesting about this is this really speaks to romantic relationships, and yet Knapp and Vangelissi say that these stages speak to friendships as well. So you might have to think, well, what would friends do? What sort of public gesture of unity would friends do? And this might be going on a trip together overseas and buying tickets to go, $1,000 tickets each to go somewhere like to Europe or something like that. That's a symbolic gesture of unity, right? It doesn't need to be a wedding, right? And a gay or lesbian couple could have a symbolic gesture of unity that is not a wedding, right? Where they have their own wedding that's not a state-sanctioned wedding, right? But it's still a public and symbolic gesture of unity. All right, moving on, the 6th stage is differentiating. And this is, believe it or not, still considered part of relational maintenance. This is where the individuals reestablish their individual identities, right? Very common, especially after people get married, but very common in this stage of their relationship. People have been together for a little while, where they start to make sure that they still have their sense of self, that they still want to spend time with their friends, they still want to do their own thing, they still want to say, this is who I am. I'm also you, I'm also a part of you, and we have our connection and our thing, but I'm also my own person, right? It is not a coming apart component necessarily, or doesn't need to lead to people ending their relationship. It's a very common part of maintaining a healthy relationship. And I know some of my friends say it's vital to their marriages that they have their own private time, that they have time to go hang out with the boys or the girls, or do a little trip here and there, do their own thing. So some people say, no, you can't do that. But it's very common, and here it is, part of the model. All right, number 7, here's where things start getting further and further from maintenance and into the land of coming apart. This is circumscribing. Circumscribing is another word for moving around. Right? So not going to the center of things, but kind of staying on the edge. Here people reduce contact and their commitment to one another. Right? They may agree to do fewer things together. They might work later, look for less romance from one another, and they may argue more. They may also suppress the status of their relationship. They just don't talk about it. The 8th stage is stagnating. This is where things just stop moving. There's a declining sense of enthusiasm. There are standardized forms of behavior like the peck on the cheek when you're going to work that you don't really give with love, or the I love you without any emotional commitment behind it. You maybe go to a ball game with a friend without any joy, or you go to a concert or do something with them, but you're not really interested in doing it. You just are doing it because you've always done it, or that's just how you work. Right? So you're just sort of going through the motions. You can think of stagnating as that, just going through the motions. Now, 9 is in avoiding. Here, partners minimize contact with one another. They see less and less of each other, and this is a very clear step before terminating, right? People don't spend time together, either directly or indirectly. They're attached from one another. They don't get involved with one another's issues. They might even show antagonism for the other person, right? Being very critical and negative of that person. Now, granted, a lot of people are critical and negative of their partners without it being an avoiding strategy or an avoiding part of the avoiding stage. But when all these things come together, Knapp and Vangelisi call it avoiding. And of course, the last stage is terminating, and here's where the relationship ends. Now, one or both people say, hey, the relationship is over. And people do this in a variety of different ways. Sometimes non-verbally, by not calling anymore, right? A lot of people don't break up with their friends. They just sort of stop talking to their friends. And it's sort of understood that things are over, right? On the far other end of the spectrum, the people that talk it out and say, hey, I enjoyed spending time with you, but we're going our separate ways. And that could include divorce proceedings, right, with papers. And that may or may not be amicable. People may not be able to be friends after that. But that's a very clear termination. Right? You have a legal contract that terminates your relationship. Right? So again, people can move through these stages. They don't have to go sequentially 1 through 10. And if you're in all of your relationships, you're going to probably jump around in different places here, right? Moving forward and moving backward, right? And as I said earlier, most relationships are going to stay in the middle maintenance stages for a long time. All right, last thing I wanted to talk about this week is the dark side of romantic relationships. Now, here's a component of interpersonal communication that was actually developed and introduced by a scholar here in San Diego by the name of Brian Spitzberg. I don't know if other people were doing the work before, but he is a pioneer in the field. And now it's a full-on field of its own, the dark side of communication. Here, in terms of relationships, what we're going to talk about is dysfunctional relationship beliefs. Right? So the dark side is basically things that don't work in communication, things that are either unethical or ineffective or harmful in terms of communication. Right? So dysfunctional relationship beliefs are harmful illusions about what constitutes the perfect romantic relationship. Right? People have these ideas of this perfect romantic relationship, and these beliefs then work to hurt or destroy the relationship. I've had relationships with people. I certainly have suffered from some of these, but I was with a woman a few years back who was very, very clearly suffered from some of these illusions, and it was devastating to our relationship. It was very hard to get close, for us to get close to one another. And as it says here in the last line here, these can lead people to destructive communication and disastrous decisions, right? Disastrous for the relationship. And that's what happened with me, right? It happens to a lot of people. I'm not unique in that regard. All right, so there are 5 particularly harmful dysfunctional beliefs that you can look out for. Right? One of these is that all disagreement is destructive. Right? To have an argument is a bad thing. You should always be in agreement. Right? People believe that is not very functional. Right? Agreement is nice. It's not always nice, but disagreement is very common. Right? It's learning how to deal with disagreement in a positive, constructive way. Right? Instead of saying you're an idiot, saying, why do you think that? Let's talk it out and figure it out. And then you can still disagree, and you can still be happy together, right? Second is the idea that couples should be able to read one another's thoughts, right? That people should know what you're thinking, right? When you come home from work and you say, I'm fine, that the other person should know exactly what's bothering you, right? That tends to lead to disastrous results. Third, the idea that a person cannot change their behaviors, right? People cannot change who they are, but they can change how they behave, right? And you might think people can change who they are. Many people I know don't. But we're just talking about behaviors. So the idea that people can't change their behaviors, right? That leads people to disastrous impacts on their relationships. The fourth is that every sexual encounter should be perfect, right? This idea that every time sexual intimacy occurs, it must be perfect. And I know that a lot of men suffer from this one, right? And I don't talk to too many women about this, but I know at least for the men that's true. And according to the scholars, it's a destructive, dysfunctional belief. And the fifth one, which is interesting, considering there's a textbook or a popular book out there called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, and it sold millions and millions of copies, is this idea that men and women are entirely different, right? The way they see the world, the way they feel about the world, and the way they talk are entirely different. As we know from our work through the semester, there are 3 different views about men and women. One is that they're very different, like this argues. The other is that there are some significant differences, and the other is that there's some minor differences, right? So the idea that men and women are totally different from one another, and they're speaking different languages, and they can't see the world the same way, they don't feel the same way, they don't communicate the same way, that belief tends to subvert and really harm a relationship. All right. One last thing that I was reminded of here is this idea that some popular beliefs, right? And it's related to this whole idea about men and women are entirely different, right? Women actually demonstrate a greater tendency in relationships towards pragma or practical love than do men, right? Women are often labeled as romantics, and they're looking for that Romeo and Juliet kind of story, where studies show that men are the ones that are looking for that impractical, romantic, otherwise known as erotic love. And so I thought that was interesting. I just wanted to share that with you. Anyway, I hope you have a good week, and I hope this slideshow is beneficial to you.